Humanity's obsession with the stars seems almost instinctive. Gods looking down on us, angels moving across the sky, our ancestors immortalized in the tapestry of the heavens, maybe even the flash of cameras from some guest observer watching us in return. After our exploration in part 1 of this 2-part deep dive, I hope it's as clear to you now as it is to me that our need to analyze what's above transcends culture and continent. It speaks to something at the core of our species, a question that refuses to die. That obsession is what I want to understand. Because, as I've said before, here at the motel, I want to understand what they are in order to understand what we are. Whether that means the children of God, the children of pure chance, the children of some advanced civilization, or simply the children of the stars, I share that same longing for truth. The journey itself brings me as much joy as the discovery ever could. I hope you feel that too. If you haven't yet seen part 1, you can find a link in the description. If you've already seen it, in this second part, we pick up where we left off. From pre-civilization to the first temples, from the dynasties of Egypt to the timeless sky stories of indigenous cultures. We now step beyond the so-called Age of Enlightenment into a world that believes it left superstition behind. But how much of that ancient gravity still pulls on us? How far does dogma still guide our science, our secrecy, our policy, even our experience of the phenomenon itself? Maybe what we call enlightenment is just another form of worship, one pointed at the mirror instead of the sky. And maybe, by seeing that clearly, we can re-enlighten ourselves now, in the 21st century, into a species unified not by fear or faith, but by curiosity. Welcome back, traveller, to the Dreamland Motel. If you enjoy the journey, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts down below. Are you a believer? If so, what do you really believe? Tonight, we're heading back to room 116. Draw the curtains, unwrap that half-melted pillow chocolate, and settle in. We begin with what many consider the start of the modern age, a world remade by fire, the post-nuclear world. After the dust of the Second World War settled, the world found itself staring upward again. But this time, not in fear of bombs. It was the beginning of a new kind of fascination. The atomic age had shown us that gods could indeed fall from the sky. But now, perhaps, they could return from it too. The 1950s were a decade of contradiction, of optimism and anxiety, of drive-in theatres and fallout shelters. It was the moment when humanity's faith in technology collided with its fear of annihilation. And amongst the mushroom clouds and the satellites, a new religion quietly formed. Across the deserts of California, men and women began to gather under starlit skies. They called themselves the contactees. They spoke of meetings with luminous beings from Venus and Mars, visitors who descended with warnings. Their message was simple: live in peace or perish. Among the first and most famous was George Adamski, a Polish-born philosopher, mystic, and photographer who claimed to have met a being named Orthon from Venus in 1952 near Desert Center, California. Orthon wore a silvery suit, spoke telepathically, and warned Adamski that Earth's nuclear testing was attracting attention across the galaxy. The meeting, Adamski said, was not just interplanetary, it was spiritual. He called the visitors space brothers, benevolent entities watching over humanity's fragile adolescence. It's easy, in hindsight, to dismiss Adamski's story as a product of the times, the blend of Cold War paranoia and post-war hope. And let's be clear, I don't really think Orthon from Venus was a real person. But the truth is more complex. People wanted to believe him. After decades of war and death, the idea that advanced, compassionate beings might be guiding us towards peace felt like a balm. The Space Brothers promised something religion, politics, and science all seemed to have lost: a unified purpose. They spoke of love, ecological harmony, and the need for humanity to join a greater cosmic federation. They sounded like missionaries, but they came from the sky. Soon, contactee circles began to spread. Figures like George King, founder of the Aetherius Society, claimed to receive radio-like transmissions from beings on higher planes. He referred to himself as the voice of the cosmic masters. King was a yoga instructor and radio operator, a man comfortable in both the physical and the metaphysical. He said the beings he contacted lived on other planets, but operated through spiritual energy. To him, religion and technology were the same thing, seen through different eyes. Other groups followed: the Ashtar Command, the Mark Age Meta Center, and dozens more. Some gathered in circles to await landings. Others published newsletters filled with galactic communiques. Their meetings were equal parts séance and press conference. Microphones replaced incense. Transmitters replaced temples. But what I find most interesting is not the claims themselves. It's the tone of those claims. Unlike later abduction stories filled with fear and medical imagery, the early contactees spoke with wonder, even joy. Theirs was not a story of captivity, but communion. They saw the saucer not as a threat, but as an ark. And quietly, the intelligence community listened. The FBI and Air Force Office of Special Investigations monitored these movements. I'm not alleging they believed the Space Brothers were real, but they did recognize the power of belief. Declassified reports on figures like George Van Tassel noted that their meetings often took on a quasi-religious tone, sermons of peace and unity, dressed in cosmic language. In the background, both the CIA and the Pentagon were studying how UFO stories affected morale and public sentiment. If an idea could spread this far on hope alone, what else could it carry? Because once you understand belief, you can steer it. Perhaps the strangest part of all is how these early contactees predicted the tone of our current moment. They spoke of global unity, cosmic environmentalism, and an intelligence that transcends death and time. Adamski and King may not have had empirical proof, but their message, one of interconnectedness and planetary awareness, echoes eerily in today's discord around NHI and consciousness. Maybe that's why these stories endure. They offered the same comfort religion always has, that we are not alone, that we are loved, that there is order in the chaos. But unlike traditional scripture, these new gospels came with photographs, radio signals, and meeting times. It was belief rendered technological, a proto-internet of souls stitched together through mail-order newsletters and shortwave broadcasts. If the ancient temples we studied in Part 1 were humanity's first stone antennas to the heavens, then these desert meetings were their electric successors, our first wireless prayers. To many, if not most, the contactees were heretics or hoaxsters. To others, they were prophets, updating the language of revelation for a world that had seen both Hiroshima and Hollywood. Their messages, written in the vocabulary of atomic light, mirrored the fears and hopes of an era that had tasted godhood and mortality at once. Even now, their influence lingers. Modern channelers still invoke Ashtar and Orthon. Meditation groups gather to invite craft to land, and NASA scientists discuss technosignatures, the faint echoes of life beyond our atmosphere. Different methods, same impulse, to bridge the distance between ourselves and the infinite. Perhaps these contactees weren't inventing a new religion at all. Perhaps they were just reviving an old one. The oldest. The one where the sky listens. The contactees didn't emerge from a vacuum. They appeared in a decade already humming with skyward tension. Radio towers dotted the horizon. Jet contrails stitched together the clouds. And men returning from war brought home stories they could never quite file away. Glowing spheres that danced around their bombers. Lights that outmaneuvered their engines. The military called them Foo Fighters. The public called them miracles or monsters, depending on the newspaper. And then, of course, there was Roswell, 1947, the moment that seeded everything that followed. The day the United States Army Air Forces announced it had recovered a flying disc, and then, almost as quickly, told the world it hadn't. It was the first time the government appeared to tell the truth, and then take it back. A single event that taught the public two lessons at once. That something extraordinary might be happening in the skies, and that whatever it was, it would be kept from them. The 1950s were special because humanity had, for the first time, both the imagination and the infrastructure to witness itself from above. We had entered the age of flight, of atom, of broadcast. we could send voices through the air and destroy cities with light. When you live in a world like that, the line between science and revelation gets very thin. So perhaps these mid-century visions weren't an accident at all. Maybe they were a reaction, the psychic echo of pilots who glimpsed impossible things over Europe and the Pacific, the lingering vibrations of rumours about secret experiments and crashed craft, the collective mind of a species finally realizing it had become a force worthy of the heavens' attention. The 1950s were when we first looked up and saw our reflection looking back. And we've been trying to decide ever since whether it's divine, mechanical, or both. As far as we know, the post-nuclear age marked the first time in human history that our curiosity about the unknown went underground. For reasons still unclear, the same governments that had just split the atom decided that serious exploration of the phenomenon, consciousness, life beyond Earth, even the limits of human perception, shouldn't be conducted in universities, temples, or public squares, but should be conducted in classified backrooms, beneath fluorescent light and lock and key. Maybe it was paranoia, maybe it was power, but for the first time, curiosity became a matter of national security. It's ironic, really. After all we learned in Part 1 about our ancestors' willingness to build temples and carve gods from stone in the open air, the 20th century chose to hide its wonder behind concrete and clearance levels. For thousands of years, humanity had been ready to meet the unknown. It was only those with their fingers on the trigger, those who had already dropped the bombs, who decided the rest of us weren't. And so began the secret faith of the state. In 1947, as stories of discs and debris swirled around Roswell, the newly formed CIA and its military counterparts were already asking a very difficult question. Not what are they, but can we use them? If the phenomenon was real, could it be reverse engineered? If it wasn't, could it be imitated, projected, to influence the enemy's mind? By the early 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union were experimenting with psychic warfare, each convinced that the other had already made progress. Telepathy, remote viewing, psychokinesis, all were studied under different project names: Bluebird, Artichoke, MK Ultra. The research was a mixture of genuine curiosity, Cold War paranoia, and the oldest human instinct of all, to pray that power might come from the unseen. But as the technology advanced, something stranger happened. The scientists began to sound more like mystics. In the 1950s, an American physician named Andrea Puharich began hosting experiments at his rural lab in Maine. He was interested in psychic phenomena, but also in its potential link to what he called non-human intelligences. Through trance sessions with a medium named Dr. D.G. Vinod, Puharich claimed to receive communications from an entity calling itself the Nine, a group of ancient beings who said they had guided humanity's evolution for millennia. According to Buharich's own notes, these intelligences identified themselves as the governing council of this planet and spoke of returning to awaken human consciousness. His inner circle included military officers, engineers, and later even high-ranking business figures. To them, the sessions weren't seance, they were research. Puharich called it channeled science. Years later, the Nine would reappear in the writings of Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, and in the claims of several government-affiliated remote viewers. Whether or not you believe the transmissions were real, their presence within classified and creative circles alike shows one thing clearly. The idea of higher intelligences guiding human progress was now part of the infrastructure. Belief had been embedded into the circuitry. By the 1970s, this fascination crystallized into a formal program. Under the umbrella term Project Stargate, the US Army and the Defense Intelligence Agency trained soldiers and civilians to see distant locations using only their minds. The method was called remote viewing, a mix of disciplined meditation, intuition, and imagination wrapped in military procedure. The results were classified for decades, but many participants claimed startling accuracy, describing Soviet submarines, hidden airfields, or even targets in space. Skeptics dismissed it as coincidence or clever guessing. Yet, even after multiple audits, the government continued to fund it. For 20 years. Someone, somewhere, believed it worked. And what's more interesting is the mindset behind it. For the intelligence community, belief wasn't a liability. It was just another tool. To remote view, one had to suspend disbelief, to enter a liminal space where data and intuition blurred. But, if it worked, it worked. It was empiricism powered by faith. The same pattern we've seen since the dawn of civilization. When instruments fail, the mind becomes the antenna. Some of those remote viewers later said their visions included non-human presences. During sessions meant to locate military targets, they would sometimes encounter beings they couldn't explain, intelligences that felt aware of being observed. One viewer described seeing a civilization on Mars, long dead, but once human-like. Another felt watched back during a session. To those who took the program seriously, the phenomenon wasn't just about spying, it was also about making contact. There's a quiet irony in that. The same government that dismissed spiritualism, astrology, and prophecy as superstition was privately investing in them, using taxpayer money. The same institutions that insisted on rational materialism were building departments devoted to invisible perception. On paper, it may have looked like science, but to the insiders, it was a ritual by another name. Behind the walls of secrecy, belief could be studied, dissected, and, if possible, replicated. Faith had become a classified technology. But as with all acts of containment, something human was lost. Those who touched the phenomenon directly often came away changed, sometimes broken, sometimes enlightened, but always humbled. The story of the post-war intelligence world isn't just about spies and secrets. It's about the slow, deliberate transformation of faith into policy. When the first humans gazed at the stars, they saw gods. When the first agencies pointed antennas at the heavens, they saw potential adversaries. But both were guided by the same instinct, the quiet conviction that something was out there watching us back. The difference is that the ancients built temples to honor it. We built laboratories to try and control it. And somewhere between those two architectures, the sacred and the secret, lies the same unanswered question. What if the phenomenon isn't just observing us, but shaping how we choose to observe it? Secular institutions still kneel at unseen altars. They've just changed the language of their prayers. Lately, I can't help but feel a kind of frustration with the irony that runs through all of this. Governments classified, threatened, maybe worse, to keep this work buried under the weight of secrecy. Collective human curiosity, perhaps the most natural expression of our species, was pushed back into the shadows. We were told it was too dangerous for us to know, too disruptive for us to see, all under the familiar phrase, national security, as if the truth itself could be weaponized. And yet, behind those locked doors and clearance levels, the goals were rarely cosmic. The men in charge weren't searching for the soul of the universe. They were searching for better ways to see a submarine across the ocean. Projects born from genuine curiosity about consciousness and non-human intelligence were bent towards surveillance, toward war, toward control. We might have finally reached a point in history where we were ready, mature enough to ask the bigger questions without fear or superstition. But that decision was taken from us. It was made, as always, by a small group of powerful men who believed they were the only ones capable of handling the truth. And in doing so, they reduced the sacred to strategy. They turned wonder into data. They taught humanity that enlightenment could be classified. Perhaps that's the greatest irony of all, that the same institutions who once burned heretics for claiming to speak to the divine are now the ones intercepting its signal and deciding, again, that the rest of us aren't ready to listen. The longer I've looked into the phenomenon, the more I've started to suspect that belief isn't a side effect of contact. It might be the entire point of it. We tend to imagine faith as something we created, a product of our imagination, a comfort against the void. But what if belief was given to us, installed like a piece of code, a behavioral architecture designed not for control in the traditional sense, but for continuity, to keep us evolving along a trajectory we can't fully see? If that sounds abstract, think about how early life learned to follow light. Phototropism isn't a decision, it's an orientation. Plants don't choose to reach for the sun. They're compelled to. What if our search for higher meaning is the same kind of instinct, encoded not in chlorophyll, but in consciousness? Every civilization begins the same way, with a story. A being descends, teaches, warns, blesses, or demands. The instructions are rarely technical, they're moral. They tell us how to behave, how to organize, how to live together. The gods of the early world didn't just create, they structured. In Sumer, the Anunnaki granted kingship from the heavens. In Egypt, Ma'at held the universe in balance through order and truth. In Greece, divine law was the scaffolding of society. Every myth was a social architecture draped in celestial robes. If we strip away the symbols, the wings, halos, thrones, and chariots of fire, what remains is a remarkably consistent formula. Obedience, hierarchy, consequence, and redemption. A moral operating system written in awe. And awe, it turns out, is the perfect stabilizer. It binds communities, diffuses conflict, and ensures the survival of ideas long after their original authors have vanished. In a way, awe is a control. The kind we volunteer for. The kind we become addicted to. Imagine you are an intelligence trying to guide a young, volatile species. You can't reveal yourself fully. They'd either worship you or destroy you. So you seed symbols instead. You send emissaries, dreams, laws, a handful of miracles, and wait to see what they build around them. If they build temples and languages of reverence, the experiment continues. If they turn that reverence into violence, you withdraw, and maybe reset the simulation. Across epochs, that pattern holds. Each visitation, whether divine or technological, arrives with rules, commandments, rituals, expectations. They shape behavior through meaning. Even today, every political or ideological movement follows the same script. A founding revelation, a chosen interpreter, and a promised future. If you think of humanity as an emergent system, belief appears to be in the firmware itself. Everything else, culture, government, science, runs on top of it. Some modern researchers in consciousness theory propose that reality itself may be participatory, that observation shapes outcome. If that's true, then it may be more appropriate to consider belief as a form of creative act. It builds the world as we perceive it. So what happens when an advanced intelligence understands this better than we do? If faith can shape reality, perhaps the phenomenon learned to shape faith. Consider the consistency of the messages delivered across thousands of years. Be kind, seek unity, respect the creation, fear the consequences of hubris. It's as if we've been gently coached toward moral coherence, a kind of spiritual homeostasis. And yet, every so often, the message fractures, and belief becomes dogma. Temples become governments, revelation becomes regulation, and the architecture of awe turns into a prison of ideology. Was that part of the plan, or just human error? Some theorists, Jacques Vallée among them, and we'll return to him later in more detail, have wondered if the phenomenon operates as a control system, periodically nudging civilization back toward balance when it drifts too far. In that sense, the gods, angels, and now non-human intelligences may all be iterations of the same feedback loop, behaving more as a source of course correction than of domination. A mirror held up at key moments in our evolution, asking the same question in new languages. Are you ready yet? If belief is a system installed by something older than us, it raises a strange paradox. Each time we outgrow an old religion, we just build a new one, sometimes without even noticing. We replace gods with governments, angels with algorithms, miracles with machines. But the structure remains identical. There are initiates, hierarchies, and holy books. Now they're called classified documents. In a way, the institutions we explored in the last chapter are simply the latest priesthoods, carrying out rituals of secrecy instead of worship. They too believe in something unseen, something powerful enough to reshape the world, and they guard it with reverence. Maybe that's why true disclosure never seems to arrive. Maybe the phenomenon understands that belief itself is the containment field. Every revelation becomes mythology the moment it's spoken aloud. Every truth becomes a story, and stories can be controlled. If these intelligences exist, whatever form they take, then why remain elusive? Perhaps it's out of necessity. If their intention is not contact, but calibration. They don't need to land on the White House lawn, or reveal themselves to every eye. All they have to do is whisper to the right minds at the right times, and let belief do the rest. Because belief spreads faster than light. It can reshape nations, rewrite history, and survive every empire that tries to contain it. It's the most efficient delivery system in the universe. If you wanted to guide a species without direct intervention, perhaps you'd build parables, not pyramids. And maybe that's exactly what they did. I wasn't given a faith growing up. Eventually, I found my way to the belief system that this channel, and perhaps this entire journey I appear to be on, now orbits around. But for most people who call themselves religious, faith isn't something discovered through searching. It's inherited, passed down through family, through community, through the simple repetition of ritual. It's being carried to church before you can walk. It's finding a Bible in your parents' closet while playing hide and seek with a sibling. Or maybe it's the quiet grief after losing someone you loved, when their beliefs suddenly feel like the only thing keeping them close. Maybe they stick. Maybe they just arrive when you need them most. I'm not saying one path is better than the other. To me, it's all beautiful. All stories, all meaning, all given. Handed down through epochs of memory, written word, and whispered tradition. But I can't help wondering how far back this inheritance really goes. Does belief itself have a beginning? Who invented belief? Was there ever a time before faith? If our moral codes and ideas of purpose can be traced all the way to the first flicker of human consciousness, why not further? Belief, in its purest form, is a kind of light. It can illuminate the darkest corners of the mind. But unexamined, that same light can blind. That's where belief becomes dogma, conviction without curiosity, faith without question. And as we move into the next chapter, we'll see how even in the so-called age of science, dogma didn't disappear. It simply changed costume. The robes became lab coats, the altars became test stands, and the prayers became equations. The gods of the past were replaced by engineers, and the miracles by machines. When the age of miracles gave way to the age of machines, most people assumed the magic had been left behind. But look closely at the man who first built the engines that could reach the heavens, and you start to wonder if the ritual ever really ended, or if it simply changed its instruments. The story begins in the dry California air, somewhere between the desert and the dream. It's the 1930s, the dawn of rocketry, and a young man named Jack Parsons spends his nights in a makeshift lab, blowing up fuel mixtures in his mother's backyard. By day, he's the brilliant co-founder of what would become the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. By night, he's a magician. Literally. A disciple of Aleister Crowley's Thelema, he leads occult rituals in a crumbling Pasadena mansion he affectionately calls the parsonage. The neighbours whisper about the chanting, the strange lights, the naked midnight ceremonies. He doesn't deny any of it. For Parsons, science and magic were simply two languages trying to describe the same thing: energy. One measured it, the other worshipped it. By 1946, Parsons' obsession had fused into a single pursuit: to contact the divine directly, to invoke a new goddess for a new age. He called it the Babylon Working, a series of rituals meant to summon the Scarlet Woman, the embodiment of feminine cosmic power. He believed it would mark the dawn of an era of revelation, a spiritual equivalent of splitting the atom. And for this, he needed a partner. Enter L. Ron Hubbard, a charming ex-naval officer and pulp science fiction writer who had recently drifted into Parsons' circle. Hubbard was quick-witted, charismatic, and curious, the kind of man who could quote scripture one moment and invent a galaxy the next. Together they set out to do something no one had ever dared: to open a door between worlds. Over 11 nights, they performed the Babylon Working. Hubbard acted as scribe, astrally observing, while Parsons conducted invocations and magical rites that combined Enochian chants, sexual energy, and sheer audacity. He called upon the goddess of the New Age to take human form, to bring enlightenment to a post-nuclear world teetering on madness. And then, the story goes, she arrived. A woman named Marjorie Cameron appeared at the parsonage days later, fiery-haired, magnetic, and utterly unlike anyone Parsons had ever met. He believed she was Babylon made flesh. Together they began rituals to conceive a moon-child, a prophesied being who would herald the next step in human evolution. Crowley himself was horrified, writing from London that his protégés had, quote, lost their minds. But Parsons felt like he'd succeeded. He wrote a text he claimed was dictated by Babylon herself. Liber 49, the Book of Babylon, proclaiming that a new aeon had begun. It was 1946. Within a year, the first UFOs would be spotted over the American Southwest. Some later suggested, only half-jokingly, that Jack Parsons might have actually cracked something open that could never be closed again. If Parsons was the dreamer, Hubbard was the pragmatist, or the conman, depending on who you ask. While Parsons sought communion with gods, Hubbard saw opportunity in the minds of men. He convinced Parsons to invest his life savings in a yacht-buying venture, promising profits that would fund their future magical work. Instead, Hubbard ran off with the money and Parsons' lover, vanishing to Florida to start a new life. Parsons tried to stop him through both legal injunctions and magical invocation. According to his diary, he performed an emergency ritual that seemed to summon a storm, forcing Hubbard's boat back to shore. But it didn't matter. The damage was already done. By 1950, Hubbard had reinvented himself again, no longer a magician's apprentice, but a scientist. His book, Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health, sold hundreds of thousands of copies. He claimed it was not religion, but technology, a system for clearing the minds of trauma and unlocking latent psychic power. It was, in a way, the same promise Parsons had sought through ritual, only now wrapped in scientific language and sold to the masses. And by 1953, it was given a name: Scientology, a new cosmology for the atomic age. The robes replaced by lab coats, the altar replaced by an e-meter. The same old hunger for contact and transcendence, repackaged, mechanized, monetized. What links these two men, the rocket engineer and the prophet of self-help, is their shared conviction that humanity could be transformed through knowledge, ritual, and will. Both believed that the human spirit could transcend flesh and gravity itself. Both blurred the lines between invention and invocation. Jack Parsons literally pushed humanity toward the stars. His jet-assisted takeoff systems became foundational to modern spaceflight. Yet, when he wasn't mixing rocket fuel, he was mixing alchemy. He believed propulsion was just as spiritual as it was physical, a way of turning the invisible into motion, of translating will into energy. To Parsons, every blast of fire from an engine was a reflection of the same divine impulse that moves suns and souls alike. Hubbard took that same idea inward. His rockets were psychological. Through what he called auditing and processing, he claimed one could travel through past lives, across galaxies, even to the edge of creation itself. In the secret teachings of Scientology, humanity's origins are explicitly extraterrestrial. Souls scattered across the stars, bound by invisible chains of ancient wars. It's the same kind of myth we've already heard, dressed in chrome. The gods became aliens, and salvation became a system. By the 1970s, Scientology's influence had rippled outwards into intelligence research. Figures like Hal Puthoff and Ingo Swann, both high-ranking Scientologists, were conducting psychic experiments for the aforementioned Project Stargate. The boundary between science and spirituality had dissolved entirely. The state was financing seances under fluorescent lights. And in a way, it all began with two men in Pasadena trying to talk to the sky. Jack Parsons died young, blown apart in an explosion in his home laboratory in 1952. Whether it was accident or something stranger, no one can say. He was 37, the same age Jesus was said to have been when he left the earth behind himself. L. Ron Hubbard lived on, building a vast movement that would outlast him by decades, ruling it with the same mixture of charisma and paranoia that had once filled Parsons' house. He swapped incantations for contracts, but the structure was the same: hierarchy, secrecy, revelation. For all their differences, both men were chasing the same revelation. As above, so below. To command the heavens, you first have to understand the soul. Some say Parsons opened a portal. Others say Hubbard sealed it. Either way, their lives mark a strange turning point. The moment when mankind stopped praying to the stars and started building the engines to go and meet them. The rituals never really stopped. If you strip away the myth and scandal, what remains is something profoundly human. Our magicians became engineers, our prayers became formulas, but the desire was always the same: transcendence. Parsons looked to the heavens and saw gods. Hubbard looked to the mind and saw galaxies. Both believed the divine could be understood, that we could systemize the mystical. And maybe somewhere we have. Maybe every laboratory is just another temple, every launch pad a new altar, and every experiment another ritual in disguise. Every generation crowns its magicians as engineers, and every machine we build is another step toward the stars. Another whispered incantation to the mystery that made us. It's strange to think of science as simply the next iteration of the same method we've always used to make sense of the unknown. But it's worth remembering, facts have always existed. To the Egyptians, it was fact that Ra sailed his solar bark across the sky. It was once considered fact that the earth sat at the center of creation. And it was once fact that the alignment of planets could cause plagues. So much so that physicians once diagnosed illness using star charts. And now, it's fact that an invisible field, the Higgs field, grants mass to all other particles. Think about that. As an expression of our time, it's no less mysterious than any myth that came before it. Each fact is simply the current language of faith. Faith that we've understood the universe correctly this time. So I try not to judge truths by their supposed certainty, but by their fruits. And yet, just because something works for now, doesn't mean it will forever. Even Isaac Newton's law of gravitation, once the most elegant truth we'd ever known, eventually yielded to Einstein's relativity. We build temples, we tear them down, and we build new temples, and we call it progress. Parsons' ideologies, however wild, were among the sparks that ignited the greatest technological leap our species ever made. It was that same technology, rocketry, that would become the foundation for our next chapter. Because, as we'll see, Jack Parsons didn't just give humanity the means to reach the stars. He may also have passed along the philosophy that still shapes those who build the machines to take us there. When the Second World War ended, humanity inherited a kind of haunted knowledge. Cities lay in ruins, nations divided. But in the wreckage of Germany's secret laboratories, something glittered. The technology that could finally lift man off the earth. It was knowledge born of destruction, baptized in fire. And America wanted it. Under the quiet name Operation Paperclip, more than 1,600 scientists, engineers, and medical specialists were brought to the United States from the ruins of the Reich. They were given new homes, new names, and in some cases, new histories. Among them was Wernher von Braun, the young prodigy who had once built rockets for Hitler, weapons that fell on London with the sound of thunder and the precision of prophecy. When he arrived in America, he looked more like a missionary than a prisoner of war. He talked about rockets not as tools of war, but as instruments of destiny. He dreamed of space stations and colonies on Mars, and of humanity's inevitable future among the stars. The press called him a visionary. His colleagues called him the father of the space age. But I can't help but see him as something older, a high priest of propulsion, carrying the torch of a mysticism that never quite died when the old order burned. To understand the world that shaped von Braun, you have to understand that Germany's rocket dream wasn't built purely on science. It was steeped in esoteric belief. Long before the war, secret societies like the Thule Society and the Vril movement wove myth and nationalism into a cosmic narrative. A belief that an ancient superior race had once descended from the stars, leaving behind both the knowledge of flight and the promise of return. In their eyes, ascension wasn't spiritual metaphor, it was a technical objective. They sought the heavens not through prayer, but through engineering. I cannot verify the following quote with 100% certainty, but von Braun's mentor, Hermann Oberth, the quiet philosopher of spaceflight, once said, "We cannot take credit for our own record advancement in certain scientific fields. we have been helped. By whom, he left to interpretation. But in his later writings, Oberth allegedly spoke of visitors, people of other worlds who have come here to warn us. It's a strange admission for a man of physics. Stranger still, that history seems to have quietly looked the other way. This was the inheritance von Braun brought with him to America. The dream of ascension through machinery, the belief that technology was a divine gift to be fulfilled through action. The empire fell, but the faith survived and learned to speak English. When NASA was officially founded in 1958, it didn't build itself as a bureaucracy. It built itself as a mythology. The names alone, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, Artemis, sound less like missions and more like scripture, each borrowed from the pantheon of antiquity, gods of communication, duality, the sun, rebirth. Each symbolized humanity's steady climb toward the heavens. Even the language of NASA carried ritual weight. The countdown, the ignition, the rhythmic call-outs, all felt like a liturgy. The control room, bathed in the glow of screens, became a sanctuary. And when a rocket lifted from the pad, roaring into the air like an artificial sunrise, it was as though the entire world held its breath in reverence. It's easy to think of those missions as the triumph of pure science, but there are parallels with their architecture and the sacred geometry of older civilizations. The Vehicle Assembly Building at Cape Kennedy, one of the largest enclosed spaces on Earth, resembles a cathedral nave, its vertical walls guiding the eyes heavenward. The Saturn V rocket itself, towering higher than the Statue of Liberty, is shaped like a modern obelisk. Its very design carries the same symbolic weight as the spires of a temple, a single line connecting earth to sky, man to God. And beneath the surface, the echoes of ritual remained. And while we look at the buildings and the rockets and point out those pretty comparisons, the fact remains, many of the men behind the program were Freemasons, including Buzz Aldrin, who carried a Masonic flag to the moon and performed a private communion before stepping onto the lunar surface. Masonic symbols appear in mission patches, inscriptions and coordinates, small fingerprints of lineage that predates the Enlightenment itself. The Apollo name was chosen deliberately. Abe Silverstein, who led the naming, said it conveyed a grand scale, the god riding his chariot across the sun. He might as well have said, "We built a new chariot, and we intend to ride it across the void." If von Braun brought the technology, he also brought his theology of propulsion, that the combustion of fuel could become a sort of sacrament, a literal transmutation of matter into light. Every launch was an act of creation, mass into energy, energy into motion, motion into transcendence. The same equation that powered the bomb now lifted humanity toward the stars. Looking more closely at NASA's imagery, the recurring suns, wings and spirals, the emblems showing chariots and flames, doves and orbits intertwined. The Apollo 13 insignia depicts a trio of horses drawing a sun across the sky. The Apollo 17 patch features the Greek god, flanked by the American eagle, encircled by stars. These aren't arbitrary designs. They're the continuation of a language that long predates flight, the language of ascension through symbol. You could argue it's purely aesthetic, but I don't think so. Symbolism has always been the grammar of belief, and in those decades, when technology had finally outpaced theology, perhaps this was how belief found its way back in. Before NASA's founding, Jack Parsons had already established the precedent, the idea that technology and transcendence were twin paths to the same peak. He mixed alchemy and chemistry, ritual and mathematics, and though his life ended in fire, the philosophy survived in those who came after. Von Braun, who spoke of destiny among the stars. Edgar Mitchell, who would one day stare back at the Earth in its entirety and experience a cosmic awakening of consciousness. NASA inherited more than the minds of engineers. It inherited their hunger for meaning, and that hunger ran deeper than science could satisfy. The atomic age promised power, but not purpose. Perhaps that's why even the most rational minds among them reached quietly toward mysticism, not out of madness, but out of longing, instinct. They wanted the universe to mean something again, and when the rockets rose, their fire seemed to whisper that it did. The scientists of the atomic age did not banish the gods. The impulse of belief remained unchanged, the same age-old yearning to rise above the dust and find communion in the light. From the occult halls of Peenemünde to the control rooms of Houston, the faith endured that the heavens are not forbidden, that the sky is not empty, and that one day, with enough courage and fire, we might stand where angels once stood, and finally learn to call them colleagues. In the early years of spaceflight, humanity was fixated on the heavens. We built our rockets, charted our orbits, measured our thrust. Every number mattered, every ounce of fuel, every degree of arc. The mission was simple: go up. But somewhere along the way, the trajectory changed. For some, the journey through the void became a journey inward. What began as engineering turned almost imperceptibly into another kind of mysticism. The astronauts reached the stars and found themselves staring back. As mentioned previously, of all of those who walked the lunar surface, Edgar Mitchell came back the most changed. Apollo 14 was supposed to be another mission. Geology, samples, precision. But for Edgar Mitchell, it became something else entirely. On the return to Earth, suspended in the weightlessness of the command module, he looked out the window and saw the planet. Small, glowing. Everything we were, everything we are. Impossibly alive. In that instant, something in him broke. He later described it as samadhi, a Sanskrit word meaning union with the divine. Mitchell said he felt himself dissolve into the cosmos. The separation between man and machine, self and star, simply disappeared. He realized, in his own words, that the molecules of my body, my spacecraft, and the universe were all one continuous energy. It was not what NASA trained him for, but it was the truth he brought home. And he didn't just experience it, he tried to measure it. Hidden in the meticulous schedule of Apollo 14 was a private experiment, the noetic test. While his colleagues slept, Mitchell attempted to send symbols telepathically to friends on Earth. Simple geometric shapes, transmitted purely by thought across 250,000 miles. When he compared the results after landing, the matches were statistically above chance. He knew better than to expect applause. NASA, still entangled in the politics of the Cold War, wasn't ready for an astronaut who'd gone to space and come back talking about consciousness. But Mitchell wasn't deterred. He left the agency soon after and founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences, dedicated to studying the mysteries of the human mind. He believed consciousness itself was the next great frontier. In many ways, Edgar Mitchell became the astronaut philosopher. Wernher von Braun was the prophet who had laid the groundwork for that revelation. By the time of Apollo 14, von Braun had already spent 2 decades turning his Nazi-era rocketry into the backbone of NASA's space program. He'd conquered orbit, built Saturn V, and seen his dream of celestial flight realized. And yet, in his later years, von Braun's public speeches began to sound less like technical briefings and more like sermons. He spoke of a unity of spirit that pervades creation. He told audiences that the deeper we explored the cosmos, the closer we came to understanding the presence of a divine intelligence behind it all. To many of his peers, these statements were just rhetorical flourishes, the soft language of a man trying to humanize science. But to those who knew him, von Braun's faith was sincere. He'd begun to wonder whether consciousness, not technology, was the true key to space exploration. And quietly, he encouraged NASA to take that question seriously. There are accounts that von Braun privately supported Edgar Mitchell's early noetic research. The two men, though separated by generation and ideology, shared the same conclusion, that the pursuit of outer space was also the pursuit of inner space. And here lies a beautiful symmetry. The engineer who launched rockets skyward, and the astronaut who followed them, only to find divinity within. One built the ladder, the other climbed it, and realized it led straight back into the mind. By the mid-70s, the agency was no longer just an engine of physics. Behind the public image of white coats and control rooms, a quieter conversation was taking place among certain scientists and flight controllers. It wasn't a conversation about propulsion or payload. It was about perception. Mitchell's reports of transcendence weren't unique. Other astronauts, including Gene Cernan and Rusty Schweickart, described similar shifts, moments where the infinite expanse outside their window produced a sudden, overwhelming empathy, a sensation that reality itself was conscious. NASA didn't publish these feelings in mission logs, but they circulated through the halls in private discussions, whispered over coffee and correspondence. A few insiders began to wonder if spaceflight itself acted as a catalyst, if the prolonged isolation, the absence of gravity, the immersion in cosmic silence somehow altered human consciousness. Even the astronauts' heart rhythms behaved differently in orbit, syncing with strange circadian patterns influenced by solar activity. Some began to half-jokingly call the condition the overview effect, but for others, it was no joke at all. It was evidence that the human mind, when untethered from Earth, might begin to perceive reality as it truly is, boundless, connected, alive. Around this time, small pockets of scientists within NASA began exchanging papers with thinkers outside the agency. Parapsychologists, theologians, even philosophers of mind. The familiar names, like Andrea Puharich and Harold Puthoff, appeared in correspondence, as if drawn by gravity to the same question. What is consciousness, and can it be measured? But NASA's involvement was always cautious. Those weren't official programs, and no funding line carried the word psychic. Still, a network began to form, a subtle cross-pollination between government laboratories, private research institutes, and independent thinkers who saw no contradiction between technology and transcendence. For them, it was just physics waiting to be decoded. It was in this cultural undercurrent that a new generation of engineers quietly took note. Men who would later merge aerospace with spirituality in ways NASA could never officially sanction. One of them was Tim Taylor, known in Dr. Diana Pasulka's research as Tyler D. Taylor had worked as a mission controller and technical consultant on several space-related programs, a man deeply embedded in the logic of machines. But, like Mitchell before him, he came to believe that inspiration itself might be a form of contact. Taylor described receiving what he called technological downloads, spontaneous insights that arrived in full detail, as though transmitted by an intelligence outside himself. He treated these moments as sacred. He meditated, fasted, and followed elaborate rituals of preparation before each connection. To him, consciousness wasn't a byproduct of the brain. It was a receiver, a device tuned to the cosmic frequency that had once guided Mitchell's intuition and von Braun's faith. Taylor didn't see it as mystical. He saw it as engineering of a higher order, one that blurred the line between signal and spirit. For now, Taylor stands as a bridge, the inheritor of a lineage that began with the dreamers of Pinamunda, passed through the mystics of Apollo, and quietly continues beneath the glossy surface of 21st century science. In the end, perhaps the most important discovery of the space age wasn't technological at all. It wasn't the rocket or the satellites, or even the footprint pressed into lunar dust. It was the dawning realization that every instrument we've ever built, every antenna, every telescope, every propulsion system is also a metaphor for the mind that conceived it. We reached outward and found ourselves reflected in the void. The farther we travel, the clearer the vision becomes. It's as though the universe, having finally been mapped and measured, began whispering back, "You were looking in the wrong direction." Mitchell heard it. Von Braun sensed it. And Taylor, quietly, methodically, began to build with it. Maybe the stars were never the final destination. Maybe they were the signal all along, calling us to look inward. Because in the end, the greatest engine humanity ever built wasn't a rocket. It was consciousness itself. When Professor of Religious Studies Diana Walsh Pasulka began comparing medieval apparition accounts with modern abduction testimonies, she expected to be working at the margins of religious history, not to become a node in a quiet network of aerospace insiders, Vatican archivists, and technologists hunting for the same thing. But once she stepped into the world of anomalous archives and high-security clearances, she realized something remarkable. The same phenomenon that shaped saints was now shaping scientists. Her journey into this hidden world began not in a desert crash site or a military hangar, but in the stillness of the Vatican's apostolic archive, where centuries of anomalous encounters were catalogued in ink long before humanity invented the word UFO. What happened next transformed the direction of her career, the world view of a NASA mission controller, and the philosophical undercurrent of the modern UAP discussion. And it began with a man she called Tyler D. But we've already talked about him tonight as Tim Taylor. In her book, American Cosmic, Pasulka introduces Tyler, who from here on out I will call Tim Taylor, a mission controller who worked across multiple agencies, including NASA, the NRO, and an unacknowledged special access program. He was a specialist, the man they called when rockets crashed, satellites malfunctioned, or classified hardware failed in ways no one understood. He lived in the world of telemetry, thrust curves, orbital vectors, and yet he believed some of his breakthroughs came as downloads, sudden, complete packets of information that arrived as if handed to him. Not imagined, not hallucinated, delivered. He had over 40 patents, many biomedical, and he credited them to a non-human intelligence communicating through consciousness. That's why he sought out Pasulka. Her research into angelology, apparitions, and saints' visions was, to him, more relevant to aerospace engineering than anything published in physics journals. Consciousness, he told her, is the next step. This wasn't metaphor. It was an operational theory inside parts of NASA. Before discussing Rome or the Vatican, Pasulka was introduced to something else, a secret crash site in New Mexico. It wasn't Roswell, and it wasn't marked. There were no fences or obvious security measures, but someone knew what had fallen there. Taylor had known the site for a number of years. He took Pasulka and Dr. Gary Nolan, a Stanford immunologist and one of the world's leading analysts of anomalous materials to the location, blindfolding them on the drive to preserve its secrecy. At the site, they collected small fragments of metamaterial embedded in the desert floor, like the relics of saints. This moment, kneeling in the desert, sifting shards of non-human hardware through her fingers, was Pasulka's first glimpse of the invisible college. Scientists, engineers, and intelligence officials who treated UAP as manifestations of an ancient intelligence interacting with humanity across centuries. For them, crash sites like this aren't a discovery. They're a continuation. After the desert came Rome. Taylor wanted to examine historical accounts of anomalous beings, the kind that left marks, healed the sick, or conveyed knowledge. Pasulka had academic access. He had something more unusual. At first, the Vatican denied him entry. Then he dropped his wallet, revealing a government ID. The guard scanned it, and Tim saw his face appear on the computer's internal system. The gate opened. Inside, he behaved like a field operative. He pointed out plainclothes intelligence agents masquerading as gardeners. He identified armed militia, not part of the Swiss Guard. He recognized tactical language and security patterns she'd never noticed. It's not just a church, he told her. It's a state. In the archives, as he examined ancient accounts of levitating saints, luminous beings, and celestial objects imparting knowledge, something inside him shifted. The patterns matched perfectly, down to the physical effects, the communication methods, the transformative aftermath. It broke him open. The man who operated spacecraft and private intelligence channels left the Vatican believing he had been interacting with the same intelligence the Church had catalogued for centuries. He underwent a quiet conversion, a merging of aerospace engineering and angelology. And for Pasulka, it was proof of a thesis she hadn't yet dared to articulate. Technology and religion were never separate. They were speaking to the same thing in different dialects. In American Cosmic, Pasulka describes a startling observation. The engineers studying UAP were behaving exactly like religious pilgrims. The crash site was a shrine. The metamaterials were relics. The secrecy was monastic. Technology had become the new sacred. And UFO artifacts, strange alloys, impossible isotopes, debris that behaved more like compressed information than metal, were treated with the reverence once given to fragments of the true cross. While working with Tim, she realized they were building a new religion without calling it one. A religion of engineers, mathematicians, and programmers. One where inspiration arrived as revelation, and invention was indistinguishable from prayer. The Vatican's interest wasn't abstract. In fact, it had its own modern apparition to evaluate. The Chris Bledsoe case. His encounter with a luminous feminine being, the Lady, triggered quiet investigation, not only from NASA personnel, but from Vatican officials who recognized the archetype immediately. They compared it to Fatima. They compared it to Guadalupe. They filed his photograph in the archives between Galileo and Copernicus, not as a novelty, as part of the great chain of anomalous human experience. The church, Pasulka realized, was watching the same phenomenon as NASA, but through a lens honed by 2,000 years of encounter, interpretation, and redaction. And quietly, it was preparing. They're waiting, she said, for secular people to get up to speed. What I'm trying to show you tonight is not a conspiracy map. It's something stranger, something quieter, a network of roots so deeply intertwined that eventually the pattern begins to speak for itself. Parsons leads to Von Braun. Von Braun leads to NASA. NASA leads to Tim Taylor. Tim Taylor to Pasulka. Pasulka leads to the Vatican. And the Vatican, somehow, leads us straight into the living room of Chris Bledsoe. Different people, different eras, different belief systems, yet all orbiting the same hidden centre, drawn in as if by gravity. At a certain point, the weight of these connections starts to feel like a truth in its own right, a self-affirming realization that scientists, theologians, mystics, engineers, astronauts, and experiencers keep finding themselves in the same room, asking the same questions, comparing notes across centuries, as though guided by an unseen hand. It reminds me of planets spiraling toward a black hole. You never see the singularity directly. You infer it from everything it pulls toward itself. The debris, the light, the trajectories of stars. We're told it's impossible to see inside a black hole, but perhaps you can glimpse its nature by examining the things caught in its pull. That's what we're doing here. We're studying the pattern, not the secret, the shape of the gravity, not the object beneath it. And one of the final bodies caught in that orbit, a man whose life has woven together religion, science, intelligence, and inexplicable light, is the figure we turn to next. A man approached by NASA insiders, Vatican scholars, and consciousness researchers. A man whose experiences echo the oldest visions in the archives, and yet feel unmistakably modern. Tonight, let's explore where Chris Bledsoe fits in this tapestry. Not to judge his beliefs, not to dissect his theology, but to understand why so many of the threads we've followed lead directly to him. If we can trace his connections, we might just see the whole pattern, or even identify the single thread that began it all. There are stories that slip into the public consciousness like folklore, drifting between campfire retellings and late-night radio calls. And then there are stories that refuse to stay small, stories that gravitationally draw in people who absolutely should not be interested. Engineers, intelligence officers, mission controllers, archivists. Stories that behave less like anecdotes and more like fault lines, running under institutions we assume to be separate. NASA, the Vatican, academia, Silicon Valley, the clandestine corners of national security. The story of Chris Bledsoe is one of those. And while his personal encounters deserve their own documentary-length deep dive, one we will absolutely take someday, tonight we focus on one thing, not on what happened to him, but on what showed up because of it, on how one family in North Carolina became a case study, a pilgrimage site, and a bridge between worlds that rarely admit they're speaking to each other. This chapter is about influence, about a man whose experiences created ripples large enough to reach mission control, the apostolic archive, and private rooms where classified PowerPoints glow in the dark. This is the story of how belief, science, and secrecy converge in a single living myth. We begin in 2007 on the banks of the Cape Fear River, the origin point of a multi-witness event whose details we'll touch only lightly here. Missing time, luminous orbs, small beings, an egg-shaped craft hovering over a rural road, a spontaneous medical healing, and a message delivered not with words, but with thought. For our purposes, the most important detail is this: it did not stay contained. It began attracting people, very specific people, from the highest levels of aerospace and intelligence, people with clearances, credentials, and long institutional memories of weird things that the public never hear about. People who recognized in Bledsoe something they could not generate in a lab or replicate on command. People who needed him. Because whatever the phenomenon was, it responded to him. And for those who have spent careers chasing a silent intelligence that never speaks, that kind of responsiveness is a priceless data source. The first major figure to show up was Hal Penmeyer, a veteran NASA scientist whose resume runs like a greatest hits of 20th century UFO involvement. Worked under Werner von Braun, collaborated with J. Allen Hynek, the lead on Project Blue Book, served as NASA's internal debunker, and spent over 11 years investigating the Bledsoe case. Penmeyer approached the family with clinical discipline, interviews, cross-checks, environmental analysis, and witness triangulation. And over a decade later, he emerged as a believer. He found 8 independent witnesses. He found consistency and patterns. More importantly, he found an experience he couldn't explain through any conventional aerospace model. And this is where the Bledsoe case rises above mere story. Because when a man trained to dismiss UFO reports for a living quietly admits he can't, other people notice, especially inside NASA, especially the ones working on programs you never hear about. The second visitor was most consequential. Welcome back to the stage, Tim Taylor, Pasulka's Tyler D., privately known by his call sign, the Dragon. To remind you, he was a senior NASA mission controller with overlapping ties to the Air Force, CIA, and NRO. Taylor occupies the rarefied world of unacknowledged programs, the sort of world where rocket failures, classified aerospace crashes, and anomalous events end up on your desk instead of the news. And he did not come to the Bledsoe home out of curiosity. He came because he believed the phenomenon used Bledsoe as an interface. Taylor's worldview blends the empirical with the esoteric in a way that many at NASA would never publicly admit. He believes consciousness is an operational part of aerospace. He believes certain minds act like antennas. He believes technological breakthroughs can arrive as downloads. And he believes the phenomenon communicates with specific people for reasons that are neither random nor accidental. So when he placed a piece of alleged UAP metamaterial into the hands of the family and watched Chris Bledsoe undergo a violent physical reaction, he didn't interpret it as theatrics. It was data. As an interesting sidebar, the late Harold Malmgren, an American writer and once part of the Kennedy administration's inner circle, advising at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, alleged that he too was shown a piece of UFO debris. It too found its way into the palm of his hand, and it too caused a visceral reaction. Interesting. But anyway, back to Bledsoe. "Why you?" Tim reportedly shouted as Chris convulsed. It wasn't a rhetorical question. It was the question the entire intelligence community had been asking for decades. Why does the phenomenon pick certain people? Why them and not us? For Taylor, the Bledsoe family was not a curiosity. It was a key. Taylor later brought Chris to Cape Canaveral and gave him access so unusual that even the astronauts rarely set foot in those rooms. Mission crew quarters, restricted wings, black glass security stations where Taylor warned, "They can read your thoughts, sing a song in your head." This wasn't a joke. Not to Tim. This is where the Bledsoe story intersects with the hidden layers of the space program. The strata where physics, consciousness, telemetry, biology, and anomaly begin to merge. Taylor revealed things that, on the surface, sound fantastical. Something came back with the astronauts. UAP have displayed hostility toward US assets. Classified footage exists of a saucer intercepting a rocket at Mach speeds. The phenomenon is ancient, physical, and intimately entangled with human history. You don't receive that kind of disclosure because you're a hobbyist witness. You receive it because the people who know the most believe you are part of the puzzle. And, as I mentioned previously, the Vatican held a deep interest, a place often imagined as symbolic rather than operational. But when Chris reported an encounter with what he called the lady, accompanied by a symbolic bull, Vatican archivists immediately recognized the archetype. Because they'd seen it before. In centuries of manuscripts where luminous beings descend, deliver messages, and alter the lives of witnesses. They quietly archived Bledsoe's experience. They sent inquiries, and they used Pasulka as a messenger. For a modern experiencer, this is unprecedented. But for the Vatican, it may simply be continuity. What makes the Bledsoe Revelation so important to our broader exploration is not simply that NASA and the Vatican paid attention. It's why they paid attention. Because Bledsoe represents a model that both institutions, scientific and spiritual, have been tracking for centuries. a model where anomalous intelligence responds to consciousness, mirrors belief, heals and harms, delivers messages, and appears to choose its subjects very carefully. In Bledsoe, they saw not a man encountering something new, but a modern continuation of a very old pattern. The pattern of prophets, people whose experiences have the ability to reshape the beliefs of entire communities, sometimes entire eras. When you hear Chris Bledsoe speak, there's something unmistakable in his voice. It isn't charisma in the usual sense. It's gentler than that. There's a softness to it, a warmth, a kind of quiet gravity that feels almost like love. And the message he carries is one we've heard echoed across centuries: unity, peace, curiosity, and a vague but persistent sense of prophecy. And that, perhaps, is precisely why we must tread carefully. Not because Bledsoe is deceptive, I don't believe he is, but because human beings are vulnerable to certainty, especially when life feels directionless and someone speaks with the cadence of meaning. We've followed voices like that before. Some led us toward enlightenment, others led us toward ruin. This is why discernment matters. Bledsoe's story is extraordinary, possibly miraculous, but the lesson he repeats is simple. He is just a person. A man who experienced something profound, yes, but not a man who should become a spiritual destination. It's our responsibility to listen without surrendering judgment, to stay open without becoming porous. Hope and reason must walk together if we're to avoid repeating the same ancient mistake, confusing the messenger with the message. Chris Bledsoe is not the first to lead humanity to this crossroads, but perhaps if we recognize that, we won't wander down the wrong road again. His experiences may have brought us to the threshold, yet it isn't his job to decide where we go next. That choice belongs to us. And so the path ahead bends one more time. In the next chapter, we follow where earlier roads have led, into an institution older than any space program, older than any flag or nation state, older than the scientific age itself. And yet, some could argue, it's just as influential now as it ever has been. In this place, the phenomenon has lived quietly, patiently, and in plain sight for more than 1,000 years. There's a strange comfort in reaching the Vatican in this journey. Not because the Church has all the answers, but because it has been looking at the same mystery for longer than any of us have been alive. Longer than any nation, any space program. Longer, in fact, than most of the frameworks we've been using to make sense of the phenomenon. After tracing our way through engineers, mystics, mission controllers, and experiencers, we arrive at the oldest institution in the Western world. An institution that has been tracking luminous visitors, aerial anomalies, and beings of uncertain origin for nearly 2,000 years. Quietly, carefully, methodically, and sometimes silently. This chapter stands apart from the NASA web that we've been following, and yet it remains deeply connected. But let's take a breath, step away from Cape Canaveral's concrete, and step into marble corridors instead. Corridors lined with saints, astronomers, and archivists who've spent centuries trying to understand what moves between the stars and the human soul. The Vatican has been watching the heavens for far longer than most realize. In fact, the Church has one of the oldest continuous astronomical traditions on the planet. Long before telescopes dotted mountaintops in Arizona and Chile, Catholic scholars mapped comets, charted planetary motions, and studied strange lights that drift across medieval skies. Unlike modern ufology, which often frames the unknown as a foreign intruder, the Church saw the heavens as part of its domain. The sky wasn't an alien frontier. It was a theological landscape. And so, across centuries, bishops, monks, and record keepers documented things they couldn't explain. Orbs hovering over monasteries, luminous discs moving against the wind, radiant beings descending in pillars of light, and, as we discussed in part 1, accounts of wheels or shields in the sky that match nothing in their cosmology, yet were preserved in the chronicles with great seriousness. To the medieval mind, these weren't craft, they were the divine passing through the atmosphere. They wrote what they saw, they interpreted through the only lens available, and the records survived. Centuries later, modern researchers reading these same documents recognize unmistakable echoes of contemporary UAP reports. Different era, different vocabulary, the same shapes. If the Vatican is the root system, the Vatican Observatory is one of the most visible branches. Run by Jesuit astronomers, scientists, and priests with PhDs in astrophysics, it represents one of the Church's most extraordinary contradictions. A deeply ancient institution, tasked with searching for life, in a universe far older than Scripture suggests. And these astronomers have been surprisingly open. Over the past few decades, Vatican theologians and observatory directors have made statements that would, in any other context, shake a congregation. The existence of extraterrestrials is not contrary to our faith. If we met them, they would be part of God's creation. The Church may baptize extraterrestrials if they desire it. This isn't fringe commentary. These are official voices speaking from the heart of the most influential religious organization on earth. Behind their words is a very clear implication. The Church has already prepared for the possibility that angels, visitors, and beings from the sky may not be different categories at all. Could this be a sign of the Church updating its language for the 21st century? Perhaps an admission that the parallels drawn between non-human intelligence and divine entities described in Scripture are many. In a very important way, recognizing the possibility that humanity has been worshipping the same thing that carries many different names would pose no theological crisis. In fact, on the contrary, it may simply expand the family. Further to this, unlike governments that panic at the idea of public revelation, The Church has had 2,000 years to think about non-human intelligence. Angels, demons, watchers, saints, messengers, intelligences. These beings are baked into the architecture of Christian cosmology. So when asked about extraterrestrials, Vatican scholars tend to respond with a serene shrug. Why wouldn't they exist? After all, if the universe is God's creation, it is vast and populated. If humans aren't alone, it changes nothing fundamental about theology. If intelligences visit us, it might be part of a divine ecosystem. If apparitions resemble modern encounters, perhaps the phenomenon is one continuous tapestry. The Vatican has never been frightened by the idea of life beyond Earth. It has been expecting it. Some even accuse the Vatican of being directly involved in encounters it knows involves non-human intelligence. Among the stranger whispers in modern ufology is the tale of a downed object, allegedly recovered not only by military actors, but with Vatican awareness, even oversight. The story, known as the Magenta Crash, is still wrapped in layers of rumour and classified fog. But the core allegation is this: a non-human craft may have been retrieved in Italy in the 1930s, and the Vatican may have been made aware, if not directly involved. Even if the story is speculative, the fact that the Vatican appears in the narrative at all speaks volumes. People instinctively associate the Church with the control of cosmic secrets, and historically, they aren't wrong. Across all these threads, one truth emerges. The Vatican is not interested in UFOs because they threaten its theology. The Vatican is interested because they support it. Visitors from beyond the Earth, intelligences moving through dimensions, beings of light with messages of compassion or warning. These are not alien to Catholicism. In a way, they are central to its worldview. Where science sees the possibility of life, the Church sees the continuation of a conversation that began long before telescopes. The Vatican once punished Galileo for suggesting that Earth wasn't the centre of the cosmos. Now it builds telescopes to search for neighbours. It once feared the heavens would dethrone them. Now they look upward, knowing the opposite is true. Finding others would confirm the universe is richer, stranger, and more alive than we ever imagined. If the phenomenon is real, if luminous beings, intelligences, and visitors have been part of the human story from the beginning, then the Vatican has been recording some of the earliest chapters. Yet they do not panic. They do not rush to conclusions. And at least on this subject, they do not cling to dogma. They simply wait, because for 2,000 years they have believed one thing: heaven was never above us. It was all around us, and something has always been watching. And once again, it isn't the message that's dangerous. It's the mind that hears it. Scripture has the luxury of contemplation, centuries of revision, meditation, poetry, debate. It has room to breathe, to settle, to be interpreted and reinterpreted, until the sharp edges dull and the meaning finds its rightful place. That's why doing this work matters to me. Writing a script gives me the space to think, to step outside the pressure and noise of the everyday world, and consider the phenomenon with clarity rather than fear. But without that time, ideas land like sparks on dry grass. Unexamined, they can ignite. Unfiltered, they distort. And before long, belief calcifies into certainty, the brittle kind. So when the Vatican speaks of heaven and hell, of angels and demons, you're free to take it literally if that serves you. But literalism rarely moves the world forward with honesty or reason. It's that same reflex, this need to reduce mystery into moral absolute, that has crept into the modern discussion of non-human intelligence. There are people in powerful positions who are utterly convinced that what we're dealing with is demonic, not metaphorically and not symbolically, literally. And that certainty, not the phenomenon itself, is what makes disclosure dangerous. Because when a mystery enters the human mind, it doesn't arrive alone. It arrives tangled in scripture, superstition, identity, fear, hope, trauma, and culture. The phenomenon doesn't divide us. Our beliefs do. And so as we step into the next chapter, we leave behind the marble halls, the satellites, the observatories, and follow the trail of those beliefs into their most volatile terrain, the place where theology, secrecy, and national power collide, where revelation isn't just a possibility, it's a risk. There is something almost haunted about the way the UAP issue moves through the halls of power. Not haunted by the craft themselves, but by the interpretations people project onto them. For the first time in human history, a phenomenon has surfaced that forces generals, priests, scientists, and analysts to confront the same question. And that's where everything begins to fracture. Not along partisan lines, not between believers and skeptics, but along spiritual fault lines that run deeper than any sensor data. Inside secure rooms in Washington, it's alleged that there are men and women who refuse to view classified UAP footage, not out of doubt, but because they fear it confirms their worst theology. Many fear the presence of demons in their command structures. The theory exists that UAPs cloak themselves in technology, and that acknowledging them would be inviting deception itself into national defense. After all, the devil doesn't come dressed in a red cape and pointy horns. He comes as everything you've ever wished for. These aren't eccentrics. These are the same people who help shape policy, control budgets, guide threat assessments. Imagine trying to explain sensor telemetry to someone who believes the object on the radar might be a fallen angel. Imagine the paralysis. It's no wonder the gears of disclosure seem to grind so slowly. And yet, just outside the blast radius, while the military ties itself into knots, a different group moves quietly in the background. A circle of scholars and scientists who have spent decades studying the phenomenon, without the panic, without the theology, and without the need to wrap mystery in fear. Diana Pasulka calls them the Invisible College, an intellectual bloodline stretching from Jacques Vallée to J. Allen Hynek himself, to modern biologists, physicists, engineers, and religious historians who compare notes in private, because public academia never gave them permission. In a way, they move like monks through two worlds, the empirical and the esoteric, the measurable and the mythic. To them, the visitors are not demons, or saviours, or adversaries. They are a continuity, a presence that appears differently depending on the age that witnesses it. A wheel of fire to Ezekiel, a shining seraph to a medieval monk, a metallic disc to a pilot, a ball of white plasma to a family in North Carolina. This is the real tension at the heart of disclosure. The defense community is trying to decide whether or not the phenomenon threatens their dominion. The Invisible College is trying to decide what it means for the human story. And caught between them is everyone else. In a classified wing of the Pentagon, a staffer praised the phenomenon is demonic because the alternative feels too destabilizing, while in a quiet library at Stanford, a scientist studies metamaterials and wonders whether ancient accounts of angels were just early attempts to describe the same physics he now measures under an electron microscope. Two realities, one mystery, and neither side quite trusts the other with the truth. Here's the part that really seems to unsettle the Invisible College. The phenomenon seems to respond to belief. It mirrors expectations. It adopts forms the witness subconsciously understands. It communicates through symbolic language that echoes whatever cosmology the observer grew up inside. To the devout, angels. To the fearful, demons. To the rationalist, advanced craft. To the mystic, light beings. To the scientist, non-local intelligence. And to the pilot, impossible machines. It's as if the phenomenon holds up a mirror, and whatever you believe is the face you see looking back. The danger isn't that the phenomenon is evil. The danger is that we keep insisting we already know what it is, before we've even asked. Every so often, a figure emerges who understands both realities, the spiritual panic of the state and the calm curiosity of the Invisible College. Tim Taylor is one of those bridges. To him, it appears the distinction between angels and advanced intelligences doesn't really matter. What matters is that the phenomenon behaves as if consciousness is the interface. As we said before, his conclusion, the next frontier of aerospace, is human consciousness itself. And whether he's right or wrong, that idea now circulates quietly among a handful of scientists and engineers who would never admit publicly that the craft might not use physics, but mind. Disclosure won't begin with a press conference. It will begin with the collapse of a worldview. Every person who encounters the phenomenon discovers the same thing. The generals who call it demonic reveal their fear. The scientists who call it interdimensional reveal their frameworks. The experiencers who call it angelic reveal their longing. And the Invisible College, quietly tracing patterns across centuries, reveals a simple and unsettling truth. The phenomenon has never divided humanity. Humanity has divided itself. And so, in part 1, we followed the old stories that transcended continents and cultures. Gods, angels, sky beings, star people. And in part 2, we've discovered that those same stories are now dividing the very institutions responsible for telling the world the truth. If you frequent the Dreamland Motel, you may now be expecting the usual ending, the gentle tug of all the threads into one woven tapestry, a final shape emerging from the fog. I try to do that whenever I can. Even when the subject is impossible, I like offering you a souvenir to take away, a map, or at the very least a compass. But tonight, I won't pretend the picture is clear. In fact, after tracing humanity's relationship with the phenomenon across tens of thousands of years, from cave walls to cathedrals, pyramids to parliaments, I find myself more uncertain than when we began. Not because the connections are weak. It's because there are too many, all pointing inward, outward, and everywhere at once. It's clear the sky has always spoken to us, but the instruments we use to listen, our belief, has changed shape with every age. And belief is a powerful thing. If there's one thing our journey reveals, it's this. The phenomenon seems to reflect whatever we believe it is. To the Sumerians, it was the Anunnaki. To the Egyptians, the solar bark and the gods of resurrection. To the Hebrews, it was angels of fire and wheels within wheels. To indigenous nations, the star people. To medieval Christians, seraphim and the luminous visitors. To mid-century contactees, space brothers. To scientists, NHI. To the military, potential threats. To the Vatican, beings of creation. To me, a beautiful enigma. What is it to you? When we look up, we're not just seeing them. We're seeing ourselves, our fears, our hopes, our faith, our frameworks. And that means something significant. If our interpretation shapes the encounter, then the greatest danger is not the phenomenon, but the lens we choose to look through. Approach it with fear, and you summon demons. Approach it with worship, and you crown new gods. Approach it with curiosity, and you invite conversation. Approach it with secrecy, and you create a weapon. We've played all four roles before, and every time, history bent around the choice. One of the most humbling realizations from this two-part journey is that we have been here before. Every civilization faced a moment where the sky stopped being background and became a question. And we've tried to answer that question in many ways. Building ziggurats, aligning pyramids with starlight and eternity, charting great cosmic cycles, preserving revelation with ink. Ancient societies didn't collapse because the phenomenon changed. They collapsed when their belief became rigid. So here we stand, at another hinge in history, with the same question every ancient culture faced. What story will we choose to tell? Let's be honest, if disclosure happened tomorrow, new religions would form by sunset. I'll admit, the UFO religion has already begun, and it's a battlefield, The phenomenon, whatever it is, seems to know that, and for whatever reason is in no hurry to help us understand. But if we're not careful, disclosure itself could become a new scripture, one not written by angels, but by institutions. If you ask me, and you have by being here, secrecy is what broke the timeline. We've let the greatest question in the history of our species be managed by a tiny circle of men whose primary tools are fear, leverage, and advantage. They didn't keep secrets to protect humanity. They kept secrets because power prefers the dark. They feared panic, but they caused ignorance. They feared chaos, but they created fracture. They feared the collapse of belief, but belief just adapted without them. And now it seems we face two futures: controlled disclosure and catastrophic disclosure. Controlled disclosure is the version orchestrated by the same gatekeepers who built and maintained the secrecy. These are the people who atomized cities in the name of peace, toppled nations in the name of safety, hid their own crimes behind the stamp of national security, and shaped public belief through suppression, misdirection, and contempt. If they deliver disclosure, you can be certain it will be polished, limited, palatable, and, above all else, beneficial to them. Books will be written, medals will be awarded. The valiant heroes of secrecy will take a bow, and humanity will thank them for giving back a truth they never owned to begin with. In their hands, I question what our future, what controlled disclosure really looks like. And I think you should too. Catastrophic disclosure is the alternative. Sudden, uncontrolled, messy, human. It could shatter economies, crack religious frameworks, unseat governments, and trigger a century of confusion. But it would have one virtue. It would give us the choice. For the first time in 75 years, the choice would be ours. And maybe that's the test we've been avoiding. There is one more thought I want to offer. Something quiet but important. Maybe the phenomenon has been patient with us. Maybe it has waited while we learned, evolved, destroyed, rebuilt. Maybe it whispered in constellations when we were young, spoke in visions when we were uncertain, and now shines in our data, our skies, our testimonies, as we finally reach a level of maturity required to hear it. And maybe the phenomenon is not revealing itself. It's waiting to see who we become first. Because if belief is the interface, if consciousness is the medium, then contact was never about them deciding to reach out to us. It was about us becoming something worth reaching out to. As we close this two-part journey, I'll leave you with what I think is the real heart of all of this. Perhaps if we find out what they are, we may still not find out what we are. Because perhaps what we are is uncertain. Are we the frightened children of a planet we don't understand? or the custodians of a legacy older than every scripture combined? Are we ready for the truth, or just ready for comfort? Are we capable of unity, or doomed to interpret the sky against each other forever? These are the questions that matter. Because if we don't understand who we are, someone else will decide for us. Thank you for checking in at the Dreamland Motel tonight. If this journey meant something to you, please like the episode, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely love reading them. It keeps the lights on in this place. Until next time, I hope we've helped your mind settle. And whatever you do next, leave a little space in your heart for whatever might be watching us back from the dark. Good night.